Well, good evening and welcome to the Commemorative Air Force Warbird 2 webinar for this evening. I'm your host, Steve Buss, and tonight we'll be looking at the Curtiss P-40, another of our featured 12 planes of Christmas. Now, we're glad that you can join us tonight, and remember, if you have any questions during the presentation, just type them in the chat box, and we'll keep a running total of all the questions, and we'll save time at the end to hopefully get all those questions answered. So joining me tonight from sunny, warm Dallas, Texas, is Taylor Stevenson, who is part of the P-40 sponsor group and also one of the pilots of the P-40 for the CAF. Taylor, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. I'll start out by saying the P-40 is the best. So no matter what you have heard, it is the best out there.
All right. Well, let's dive into the history of the airplane itself. First flights, some of the design and production characteristics of the Curtiss P-40.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got some photos that I'll kind of show. So the P-40 was a single engine, single seat, inline driven fighter that was first flew in October of 1938. And it was really a derivative of the P-36 Hawk, which was a radial power, essentially a P-40 for all intents and purposes with a radial engine. And so in the late 30s, they put the Allison V1710 on the front of a P-36, and it really became the P-40. So it's just a beautiful airplane, a great airplane to fly. And it saw just a wide range of basically every theater. A lot of the Allies flew them, and that was mainly because, as a late 30s aircraft, it was available come Pearl Harbor. So there were about 14,000 built during the course of the war, which I believe put it as the third largest, the third most produced fighter behind the 51 and P-47. So it really was just it was a great aircraft. It's kind of a funky aircraft too. It's very electrical. The prop is a Curtiss electric propeller that's electrically driven. The landing gear is electrically driven hydraulic landing gear. The in model that the CAF has, it has 650 caliber machine guns. It could carry about 2,000 pounds of ordnance on 3 hard points. So for a ground attack role or a low level fighter, it was great. It did not have the high altitude capabilities that some of the aircraft with, two-stage supercharger did, like the 51. But it did prove itself to be a wonderful fighter, and I can tell you it's just a wonderful flying aircraft.
About how many hours do you have in the P-40 now?
Oh, I've got about 30 hours in it. And we'll talk about it a little later. We had a landing gear collapse that halted my progress. But I've been a member of the unit, the sponsor group, for about 3 or 4 years now as a pilot. So it's about 3 years as a pilot. So it's just a lovely airplane. I kind of tell everyone it's a appropriately powered T6 with an awesome roll rate. It's nimble. It's an amazing aircraft. So, but like I said, as a pre-war aircraft, it was really ready to use right off the bat. So I think one of the first times it really entered combat during World War II was with Squadron 112 and some of the North Africa with the RAF. And this was actually the shark teeth you see on these aircraft in the 112 squadron. That's actually where Charlie Bond and Eric Schilling of the AVG got the idea for the Flying Tigers paint scheme, and that's what actually the Flying Tigers made it famous. But really, it was the British that came up with it. So that's a little known period in the P-40's history. Really, what the P-40 is known for is the Flying Tigers, which over early in the war, and we'll talk a lot more about this a little later, but essentially flying mercenaries for the Chinese, and really just a bunch of larger than life personalities that got a lot of press prior to the war before we had really entered. So it was really the first time that the Americans really got in the fight, them and the Eagle Squadron. So I think early on the first time that the P-40 really entered service with the U.S. during World War II is right off the bat. Of course, we all seen Tora and the unfortunate remake of Pearl Harbor. But the P-40, two of them, the two famous ones that got up were, of course, George Welch and Ken Taylor, who were typical. I think Ken was 21 and George was 22. Typical young 20-year-olds out till 6:30 in the morning, dancing, playing poker. I think they were at a Christmas party at a hotel in Waikiki, and I'll say they fell asleep around 6:30, and at 7:55 they woke up to the sound of aircraft, gunfire, and explosions, and in their tuxedo raced to the airport, their air base. They called ahead at Haleiwa, I believe, airfield over in, and got their aircraft ready. So they showed up and they only had 30 cal ammunition, which it had 6 guns early. The B models had 6 guns. They had 4 30s in the wing and 2 50s up front. So they only had the 30s in the wings, and they said to heck with it. And then their tuxes jumped in it and went right off the bat into a 6-to-1 against some Vals. I believe that Ken actually ended up with 2 kills and 2 probable kills that were later confirmed with the Japanese. So Ken Taylor got 4 kills that day, and George Welch, I believe, got 2. So it was really the first time we got into the fight was in P-40s. And so they scrambled that first time, landed at Wheeler, got 50 cal ammunition, and then went right back in it. And there's a couple quotes from Ken Taylor that I love. He was, when he took off from Wheeler into a flight of Japanese bombers, he did a Chandelle and came right up into a flight of Zeros inadvertently with all the smoke and everything. And right about that time, I guess it was a backseater in a Kate or something, around from one of the bombers, blew up right in front of his face, and he was hit in the arm and the leg. And when asked about, what he felt at that time, he said it was of no consequence. It just scared the heck out of me for a minute. And he said, were you ever scared in all this? He said, well, I wasn't in the least bit terrified, and I'll tell you why. I was too young and too stupid to realize that I was in a lot of danger. So I think that day we got, over a dozen aircraft in the air, and I think there were around 10 kills that they performed. So the P-40 really was America's intro into the war. So another famous unit that flew the P-40 in Italy and in the Mediterranean and in training was the 99th Fighter Squadron, which of course was the Tuskegee Airmen. They flew it in the 39 early on in the war, so they saw a lot of combat. And then of course all our allies flew the P-40. I mean, because it was available, once we got replacement or new aircraft like the 51, some of the 40 production could go to our allies. So here you can see Gloria Lions, which I actually think that's still preserved in New Zealand. I believe that was pulled out of the John Smith collection a little while ago. But New Zealand flew them. The Soviets even flew them, which I can't imagine how cold that would have been in a P-40 in Soviet Russia. But there's just a ton of history to the aircraft. It's a piece of history. It's great.
So let's talk a little bit about you mentioned the P-51 Mustang. The P-40 was our frontline fighter at the start of World War II, and obviously surpassed by the Mustang later on, and other aircraft like the Spitfire. But you've flown both. What's kind of the nuances between the two airplanes, the P-40 versus the P-51?
So the Mustang is faster. It's a great, I'm sure it would have been a great dogfighting aircraft. It's a great escort aircraft. It was actually built into the design that the stick forces load up. It gets heavier and heavier the faster you go. So that's something that the P-40 doesn't. So the P-40 is a very light aircraft. You can be at 180 miles an hour, 280 miles an hour, over 300. The stick forces are the same on it. It's has a much faster roll rate than a lot of the other fighters, including the Mustang. It's just a great. I think it would be great in a dogfight. It can really turn on a dime. It doesn't depart when it stalls. It doesn't depart as aggressively as a Mustang. But I mean, speed-wise, the Mustang's definitely got it. But as a the Mustang would have been a great fighting airplane, but as the P-40 is a pilot's airplane. It's just, like I said, it's a T6 with appropriate power and an awesome roll rate. It's fun.
Now, it in the hands of inexperienced pilots didn't do quite as well against the Japanese Zeros, but with more experienced pilots, it could hold its own against the Zero, which has always kind of been one of the knocks that you read about the P-40s, that it was not as good as the Zero.
No, I mean, it's like anything. If you give a you give a tool to nobody that's ever worked the tool or that has little experience with the tool, they're not going to perform as well. So that's a little bit of the Flying Tigers deal. Was they had guys that showed up that had claimed to be fighter pilots and weren't and stuff. So there was a little learning curve there. So that's why Chennault stuck with the strategies he did, where don't get in a turning fight with the Zero because it'll out turn you in the dogfight. But now you put the right pilot in that airplane and it'd be fine. And the skill level of our pilots and the Japanese pilots was kind of did the exact opposite. Later in the war, their pilots weren't great, and we had all these combat experience, great training. The whole training complex in America was pumping out awesome pilots. Another thing that we had that the Japanese really didn't was, especially our mechanics. You know, the average country boy in America had worked on a tractor, and it's the same principles as working on an internal combustion engine on an airplane. The Japanese didn't have that, so later in the war, when they lost some of their carriers with their really skilled mechanics, that was where a lot of their downfall came from. Plus, they found that a lot of the great fighter pilots, especially in the AVG, the best ones were ones that had shot rifles and stuff like that before the war, because they knew the principles of leading and all of that. The Japanese didn't have that as well. So there's a lot of factors going into it, but you put one of those skilled guys behind a P-40 and I'd be scared going up against him.
So with the P-40 served throughout all of World War II, and then with some of our allies beyond that, but it really didn't have much of a life after World War II.
No, it really didn't. I mean, you look at it and the surplus that the guys bought that they wanted to fly. Of course, if you got up there and you saw a brand new P-51 from the factory the day before in a 3-year-old slower P-40, you'd pick the P-51, you know. Or that's why a lot of T-6s were saved, and a lot of fighters didn't, is because you could go to North America and get a T-6 and you can use it as a training aircraft. You can put a person in the back seat. It's just more, and you're burning half the gas. So the P-40 really, until the 60s, really there weren't many to speak of flying. And then, of course, now they're having a massive resurgence. There's probably a dozen in restoration right now. So yeah, when the CAF really started, I've got some of the original paperwork that shows that they were actually on the hunt for a P-40 and they couldn't find one. And so that's kind of where our airplane kind of comes in. And the P-40, the CAF originally had an M model, as in Mike, P-40, that was lost in 1965. And so that's where then ours kind of became the replacement. The one we have today, the N model, is a replacement for that one.
Well, let's talk just a little bit about the history of this particular airplane. The N model is, as you refer to it, it has a storied history of its own, not only with the CAF and flying at air shows for many, many years, but even before that.
Oh, our P-40 has an awesome history. I love it. So I'll get over here. Our P-40 actually has history with the Royal Canadian Air Force. So it was built in 1943. It was a Curtiss P-40N-5 Warhawk when it left the Curtiss factory in Buffalo, New York. And it was one of 35 P-40s that in September of 43, we actually delivered to the Royal Canadian Air Force for quote unquote home defense. So the serial number from the Air Corps serial number was 105867. So since the RCAF didn't have that many, they just kept 867. So this is actually a picture of our P-40 when it was with the Royal Canadian Air Force. And here's another picture. It's the one in the back. So you can see it was all bare metal with a kind of an OD glare shield, PN on the front, and the RCAF rondelle and an OD vertical stabilizer. So it was delivered to RCAF station in Patricia Bay, Vancouver Island, British Columbia. So really they're up kind of north of Washington to 111 Fighter Squadron up there. And it saw combat sorties in World War II patrolling the Aleutian Islands against the Japanese up there. I haven't found any confirmed proof that it ever entered any engagements or had, you know, hard combat history, but it did fly patrols and kind of a unique among the survivors, which most warbirds that survived were either wrecked or they were stateside trainers, and that's why they were kind of saved. So it served with the RCAF from 43 to 46, and then kind of went off the grid through a couple of owners. And here you can see the little color profile of it. But it went through a few owners and kind of just sat derelict at Junior Birchnall, who's a big name back in the 50s and 60s here outside of Dallas at Paris, Texas. He had a big collection. It sat out there until about 1958, when a guy by the name of Glenn Bucket Parker, his nickname was Bucket, I got that one, basically disassembled it and trucked it to Port Arthur. And that's where really the savior of our aircraft came into play. It was a guy by the name of Mike Dillon, who was late 20s and would kind of drove. He was doing, I think, one of his cross countries for his private or commercial, and he landed at Port Arthur and he sees this derelict kind of P-40 sitting in the field, and started talking to Bucket Parker about it. And between the two of them, they worked on it for about a year and got it to the state you see here. And Bucket flew it once, and the engine was trashed, no oil pressure, and it landed and sat there. And so for 3 years, Mike Dillon would come back and forth from college and see this wonderful piece of history there degrading at Port Arthur, out in the Gulf salt air and everything. And finally, he couldn't take it anymore, and so he to save it from basically either turning to scrap or being scrapped, he called up Bucket and said, hey, you know, I want to buy your airplane. And Bucket said, okay, $800. And I think Mike said he had $50 in he and his wife had $50 in their saving, and she went to the credit union and maxed out her credit and got $700. And so they came to Bucket with $750. He said, fine. And so here he was, late 20s, trucking a disassembled P-40 to his to, I think, Sky Harbor Airport out in Phoenix, where he was located. So there it is. I think my wife would have a heart attack if I pulled something similar, but then again, I guess prices are a little different these days. So when he got it to Sky Harbor, he figured it would probably take about $2,000 to restore it, and he ended up being way off. I think it actually cost about $9,000. But when he needed that $2,000, he dressed up in his best suit and he went to another bank and walked in and essentially finagled his way into a $2,000 loan by saying he was the owner of a very valuable aircraft and blah, 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 and left a few of the details out. So with that, he got started. And of course, P-40 parts were not very common, especially, like we said, since not that many were saved. But between that, he managed to find, you know, an engine in LA, a part here, retract cylinder kits here, and he finally got the thing flying in, I believe, 1964. And when he was deciding what to paint it, he said, it's a fighter, it should be all red. So this was hit on its first flight, all red with a polished propeller. So about that time, I think it was 1964 or 65, one of his first big trips was to Harlingen to the CAF show. And when he got there, you can see the white P-40 in the background is the original M model that we had, and Mike Dillon in the one we have now. So when the M model crashed, and that was unfortunate, it was a fatal accident, but it was the guy was doing aerobatics with the flaps down. It did a roll with the flaps down and stalled and went in. The CAF worked with Mike to acquire what is now or what was then and now November 1226 November, which is the tail number of our P-40. So here it is in all its red glory when the CAF got it. I mean, it was, I know for some purists, it's not their favorite, but I gotta say, if I owned a P-40, and if I owned this P-40, it would be in the red or it'd be in that RCAF markings. I just think that red looks cool, like it would go around the pylons at Reno, which actually this P-40 did. So when the CAF got it, they of course put white and blue stripes on it, shark's teeth, and operated it for years like this. 1977, Walt Estridge raced it at Reno. Joe Engle, the astronaut, flew it for years. Here it is at the old hangar in Harlingen. And if you look in the background, you can see the cool paint job on our Hellcat, the black and red. I think there could be a whole webinar on the early CAF aircraft paint schemes. They had some neat ones. So basically, it was flown by all the CAF greats, Lloyd, Lefty. I mean, for years, it just was always flying. Here it was in the old 2.6 markings, which is completely fictitious markings, but flew in the 70s and 80s like this. In the early 90s, it was painted to Tex Hills markings, which we can talk about a little later, but it was flown for years, 20 years probably, by Ollie Crawford, who's here in this photo. And Ollie first flew the P-40 when he was 19 in World War II, and he flew the CAF's P-40 up until he was around his 80th birthday. And so he was, I gotta say, holds the record for the longest continually flying P-40 pilot out there. And even after his 80th, he hung up his own spurs on the P-40 and said, 80's enough. But even after that, he was flying L-39 jets. After that, he was, I think, the oldest person to go up in a U-2 spy plane up to the edge of space. And so he's really the CAF Hall of Famer and really an awesome individual. We lost him about a little over a year ago. But he and another CAF Hall of Famer and great guy, Ray Kinney, and my dad kept the P-40 flying in the 90s and 2000s. And so in 2000, about 2003, it was repainted to this scheme, which was another rendition of Tex Hills markings. It's at the time, it is actually true that Tex Hill picked out these colors out of paint chips, and the unit went down there and talked to him, but they were off a bit. So we're really excited now to kind of be on the unveiling it in its really historically accurate colors after this rebuild. So that's a happy camper after his checkout, I'll tell you that much. But yeah, it's on the left is Ollie Crawford, right is Ray Kinney and myself. And the neat thing about it is Ollie taught Ray to fly the P-40 and Ray taught me. So there's a lot of history within this aircraft. And I'm just very, very glad to be a part of it.
One of the things that picture of you after your checkout, you get the big smile on your face, of course, but there are no two-seat P-40s where you can learn, are there? So it's kind of, you have to do your homework before you get in, right?
So there are. They did have a TP-40 mod that they did back in the war. There are a few of them flying. I think Kermit Weeks may have the only original one. Don't quote me on that, but I think it's the only original. But several have been converted to full TF conversions. So Tom Richard down in Florida will do P-40 training in his. But no, for me, it was really, and for all the single seat fighters, it's you go out for the CAF and first get selected. You have the prerequisites of total hours, T6 time. You go do 2 check rides with 2 check airmen in the CAF who are actually riding in the front seat of the T6, and you're flying from the back to simulate the lack of visibility you have with the big engine in front of you in the fighters. So you do 2 of those, and then a lot of times it's, they pat you on the back and say, don't scratch it, and you're off to the races. But it is the T6 was called the pilot maker for a reason. It's an amazing aircraft. It's got a lot of not bad characteristics, but difficult characteristics that were built into it intentionally. So whatever you did after that was easier from an aviating standpoint. Of course, the systems are a lot more complex in a Mustang or a P-40, than a T6. But when you first fly the fighters, it's kind of a non-event from an aviating standpoint, aside from the systems. The T6 is it's the standard. So, but yeah, it is a little bit of a don't hurt yourself, kid, and you're off to the races. But by that point, though, you've spent hours in the cockpit looking at everything, making airplane noises, looking through the manuals and knowing everything by heart. And so you really, that first time, you do and should know the airplane like the back of your hand. I mean, it's quite an event. But yeah, I was really smiling. And the great thing too is that I'll show you a neat photo. I'm second generation P-40 pilot on this aircraft in my family. So here my dad and I are 20 years apart in the same airplane right after our checkouts. So it's I grew up around this aircraft, and it's kind of weird to say, but I think a lot of people will relate that some of these artifacts and aircraft and vehicles and stuff like that, they really do become part of the family once you've been around them. So it's, like I said, it's the biggest honor of my life to get able to fly it now.
Well, that's good. And you mentioned the airplane has not been flying recently. It got a little scraped up a couple of years ago. Talk us through what happened and what's happened since then, and how close are we to seeing it fly again?
We are so close. I'm chomping at the bit. But back in March of 2019, unfortunately, we had a gear collapse on it. What it was there's a casting in the landing gear it looks like a T that's got a threaded portion, and that's kind of where you can adjust the landing gear, and it's very integral to the integrity of the gear. Well, come to find out, that part from the factory was not built to specs, and so a crack kind of started propagating, and it's very, very hard to see unless you're looking for it. And so it sheared, and when that shears, there's nothing supporting that left main landing gear. There's nothing supporting it, and so it collapsed. And unfortunate for us, but it's kind of if there is a silver lining. Of course, the Warbird community is a very small community, and everyone has each other's backs. So we sent out a deal to everyone like, hey, inspect your airplane, inspect your parts, your spare parts, because this happened to us, and we want to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. And I think there have been over a half dozen other, either on aircraft or in the spare parts, that people have found cracks. So if there's anything a silver line to take away, is maybe we help some other people out. Now, I wish it had happened to other people, but you can't win everything. So yeah, back in March of 2019, the gear collapsed. The pilot that was flying it did an amazing job keeping it on the runway until the last little end where you can see it. It ended over here in the grass. So it prevented a lot of damage to the other landing gear, the scoop, the cowl flaps, and stuff like that. But unfortunately, the propeller was damaged, as you can see. And anytime there's a prop strike, you got to inspect the engine. There's a little damage to the landing gear system, the right outboard wing panel, the left wingtip, left panel, aileron, flaps. So it could have been a lot worse, but there was significant damage to the aircraft. So when we all talked about it, here's that part you can see way up in there that actually failed. It's very hard to see, but it's up in here. So when something like this happens, you all get to the table and you decide what to do. And we said, you know what, let's basically turn this into an excellent opportunity to inspect the entire aircraft, do an IRAN on it, or a little restoration. The IRAN is inspect and repair as necessary. So we ended up really kind of restoring the aircraft. And it would not have, none of this would have been possible had it not been for one of our sponsors taking on the project. Mark Allen did an amazing job. Almost, telling the whole wing, look, I'll take the aircraft, I'll rebuild it, with the help of Randy Wahlberg, who's an IA inspector down in Pearland, Texas, and a group of about 4 individuals with him. They've really tackled this project, and it would not be near the state it is without them. So we really thank them. So the incident occurred in Conroe, Texas, just north of Houston. So we removed the wing from the aircraft and trucked it down to Mark's hangar in Pearland. And Mark started to tackle it. You can see here, we left the wing off. We inspected all of the landing gear system, the electrical system, all the hydraulic system. pulled the engine off, sent it back to the engine rebuilder. The unfortunate thing about this incident as well was the engine only had 40 hours on it from a complete overhaul out at Vintage V12's. Mike Nixon and Jose Flores' shop out in California. And so we sent it back to him, and luckily there was no internal damage, although they cracked the entire engine apart, which is tens of thousands of dollars to do, and sent it back to us. So took the time to restore the just about every aspect of the aircraft. You can see here, got the wing on. I always thought that was kind of a cool photo of it gear up like it's strafing the hangar. And here's Randy Wahlberg helping install the engine back on the aircraft. And like I said, it's a V12 V1710 Allison engine made by General Motors. It's about 1,250 horsepower and really a bulletproof engine. I mean, there's a lot of maintenance you have to do on a Merlin that you don't have to do on an Allison. It's a great engine. So here it is back installed in the aircraft, fitting the cowl back up. And one of the neat things is we took the time to really do a cosmetic and mechanical restoration of the entire cockpit, put a new, all the hydraulic shelf over here to the left. The red handle there with the little tab on it is the landing gear handle, and the yellow one is the flap handle. And the P-40, it's kind of an interesting hydraulic system. On the control stick, there's a little box, and if you're holding the control stick with your right hand, your pinky can flick this little switch that activates the hydraulic system. So what you do to like raise the gear, it's kind of an odd thing. You have your left hand on the throttle, right hand on the stick. You take your left hand, move that little knob forward on the red landing gear handle, pull it up, then hit the little pinky switch with your right hand. Take your left hand back to the throttle, then take your left hand over to the stick when the gear's up, because you want to make sure the gear's up and there's no physical or visual indicator that the gear's up. You take your right hand off the stick, swap it your left, go over to the right side, pump a hydraulic hand pump. And so it's just a lot of monkey motion and stuff, but it's 1930s technology. It's the transition between biplane fighters into, what became the Mustang and the Bearcat and Tiger Cat and all the high performance ones. So, really restored the entire cockpit. Here it is when it just got on its landing gear. All the repairs of the wings were done beautifully. John Fallis out in Louisiana helped us fabricate wingtips and parts, and brand new, upgraded radio stack for the aircraft. And we actually converted the propeller over to a different style propeller, which necessitated getting a new spinner. And this is a custom built, brand new spinner out of New Zealand. Pioneer Aero down there did a wonderful job. It is beautiful, but there my dad is next to it, and you can see the actual, you don't realize how big these spinners are until you get them off the aircraft. So here's the new propeller being installed. And I actually have, let me do it. This was this is the first engine run of the P-40. So no squawks. It ran like a top, and just a really great outcome for a wonderful restoration. So we're just in the final, like I said, the final stages of the restoration, finishing up the paint job, and then we'll be doing flight testing and hopefully be at air shows near you in 2021.
Awesome. You talked earlier about the fact that parts are somewhat hard to find, especially after the war for the P-40. I would think that that's still the case. It's not something you can go to Napa and pick up off the shelf, obviously.
No, it's not. But everyone always kind of says like, oh, the airplanes are only going to be flying until we run out of parts or engine parts or whatever. But there's been so much technological advances in the past even 5 years with CAD machining, with computer automated design, with just about every aspect of machining has really jumped up. And so there's no part on the airplane that cannot be made now. And you see that a lot with the P-51 Mustangs. I mean, I don't think there is a part on the Mustang that isn't or can't being built right now. So really, the saving grace is a lot of these operators out of New Zealand and Australia are making tons of P-40 parts. So you say that, and yes, they are hard to find original, but you can have stuff made if you need it. So it's great. I mean, at the end of the day, I always kind of say if they could do it in 1938, we can sure do it now. I mean, it's all about metric amounts of cubic dollars you throw at it, but it's we were very lucky in that we did find, and like the T in the landing gear that failed, we were able to source a brand new one with the proper machining and everything. So it's not as big an issue as you'd think.
Looking at the airplane in restoration, what is the paint scheme going to look like when it's ready to fly?
So I'm super excited. It's going to remain in Tex Hill's markings because Tex Hill was Flying Tiger number 48. He was a great friend of Ollie Crawford, Ray Kinney, my dad, myself. Some of my earliest memories were with Tex and Maisie. So he has a real good connection, not only with our aircraft, because he would support it at air shows, across the nation, but also with the CAF. He was a big supporter of the CAF. So I think it's only appropriate that we continue to honor Tex. And not only that, he was a larger life personality, triple ace, and the Flying Tigers. There's about no other cooler story you could tell with the aircraft. So while the aircraft is a later in model, we really went to great lengths to make the paint scheme accurate to what would have been a Flying Tigers aircraft, and try to make the lines of the P-40N look more like the early P-40s, because the early P-40s had a real short scoop on them, and the P-40 has a big scoop. So I did a ton of research, probably more than anyone ever wants to know about Flying Tigers paint schemes. But the Flying Tigers, let me just kind of start with that. So the Flying Tigers was the first American volunteer group. Essentially, the founder was Claire Chennault, and in 1937 he went to China and was really kind of working with General Ichimo Chiang Kai-shek. That's his military aviation advisor, and so he really had Chiang Kai-shek's ear. And with the impending, the Japanese invaded Manchuria and there's the Japanese aggression, he convinced Chiang Kai-shek that, look, air superiority, you need to get that now, or at least start it and really nip this in the bud. And so in the winter of 40-41, Claire Chennault went to Washington and lobbied and was able to procure the right to purchase 100 Hawk 81s. They weren't P-40 Bs or Cs. They were Hawk 81s, and really that was just a designation for the export version of the P-40, which I think these were intended for the RAF, and so they allocated them to the Chinese, and he also got the right to go and poach 100 pilots from the U.S. military and 200 ground crew and support personnel. And so he started going around and had a couple of people operating for him, going to these Air Corps, Marine Corps, and Navy bases, essentially saying, hey, we can't tell you too much about what you're going to do, but do you want to enter combat now? And oh, by the way, you get paid at least $600 a month to go do it, which was about over three times what they were getting paid in the U.S. military. And every time you shoot down an aircraft, we're going to give you a $500 bonus. And so money talks, and it's something about the American spirit, like I said, that we wanted to get into the fight and really help out our allies. So that, coupled with the financial incentive, because you got to remember, my great grandfather bought a 41 Plymouth from the factory for $900. So some of these guys were making the better part of a new car every month over there. And they ended up with that being able to recruit around 40 from the Air Corps and about 60 from the Marines and Navy, and sent them over to China. And the way they kind of did this was, there's a lot of the Lend-Lease and neutrality provisions that we were kind of negotiating, and so they pulled it off by essentially creating Chiang Kai-shek gave them the executive order to do this. They created the CAMCO, which was the Central Aircraft Machining Company, that the 100 pilots would resign from the military and then be hired as essentially consultants for this CAMCO. And that's how they got them all over there. So all the aircraft were owned by CAMCO. The pilots were employees of CAMCO. So yeah, they ended up having only 99. I think they dropped one of them into some water, salt water, and so they ended up with 99 and formed 3 squadrons of the AVG: the first pursuit, second pursuit, and third pursuit. And so the aircraft arrived really in just bare camouflage that was intended for the RAF. And so the first part about the paint scheme was really nailing down the colors and nailing down the design of the RAF Lend-Lease paint schemes. So during combat, the Flying Tigers were very successful. Like I mentioned earlier, Chennault was basically his fighting doctrine that, look, the pilots, a lot of them were fighter pilots, a lot of them weren't. They trained a lot of them, but between pilot experience and then kind of the quote unquote alleged poor maneuverability compared to the zero, Chennault said, look, get above them, use your speed, go through them, shoot down as many as you can and keep going and they can't catch you. And so they use this very effectively. I think there were about 19 or 20 aces in the Flying Tigers with almost 300 enemy aircraft shot down and 14 AVG pilots lost. So since they were really the first Americans in the fray and it was such a kind of a ragtag bunch of personalities like Tex, they really got a lot of press coverage. And so that's why it's just, they were on every newspaper, every magazine, and they're really larger than life. But they were eventually disbanded in 1942 and replaced with the 23rd Fighter Group, which was an Air Corps unit. So first things first, the number 48 was Tex Hill's airplane. There are very few original photos of the aircraft. I think there are only 2 that I've been able to find. This is his number 48 with Tex when it arrived. Over there in 1941. And as you can see, there's no shark teeth. And they may be actually in the process of adding the Flying Tigers markings. But this is the only other photo of Tex's aircraft. And of course, this one shows the 48 on the tail there. That little white mark is the CAF serial number, but that was the Chinese Air Force serial number. And then of course the teeth. So there are a lot of details that because we have so few pictures of the original aircraft, there are a lot of details you have to draw from the other aircraft in the unit. And Tex always, I'm sure he hated this photo because a lot of the 48's one of the most iconic of the P-40s. And as such, because of Tex, as such, a lot of artists have painted it, a lot of, it's been in pop culture and all that stuff, but that 48 actually never saw combat with the AVG. It was wrecked right here in December, I think December 20th of 41. And it actually never saw combat. So Tex, I remember being, I think it was at Midland Air Show, and there, they had the autograph tent where all the veterans are in there signing autographs. And Charlie Bond, who was a AVG ace, was at one end, and his good friend Tex was at the other end, and they really were good friends. But at Tex, is telling some fighting story, and Charlie just stands up out of nowhere and just screams across the tent, "Hey, Tex, tell him when you wrecked your airplane on landing." And Tex had a few choice words to say across the room, but it was all in good spirit. So yeah, he actually wrecked it before it got into combat. So like I said, we have to draw a lot of details from some of the other aircraft. So the camo is one of the interesting aircraft aspects of the aircraft. A lot of camouflage on these World War II aircraft were feathered lines on the edge of the demarcation between 2 colors, meaning they didn't tape the edge. They didn't, they really didn't do anything to make it crisp. They just kind of shot it with a gun. It had a feathered edge. Well, actually, AVG aircraft should have a sharp edge, because you can see here, these were some of the AVG aircraft, or the early export versions, being painted at the factory. And what they did was they hung big rubber mats in the shape of the camo, sprayed over it, and then pulled the mats away, and it left the original color in the demarcation. So all the demarcation on the aircraft is hard lined like original. Here's the gray being applied to the underbelly, and the camo being laid out. And as you can see, if you look on the left and right wings, on the outer board of the wing, it looks like there's kind of a circle, a perfect circle in the camo. Well, what that was a blank left for the RAF, who is the original intended purchaser of these aircraft, to put their roundel, their national insignia on it. Well, they went to the AVG instead, and so in a lot of the aircraft, you can actually see they didn't use that gap for the roundel. They actually put the nationalist Chinese roundel outboard of that. So we incorporated a lot of these details that really allow for a good teaching story for those freaks like me who just love all these details. We were really thankful to the Flying Heritage Collection up in Washington, the late Paul Allen's collection. They helped us out. They've got a beautiful, I think, C model P-40 and AVG markings, and so they helped us out sourcing the color, the correct paint colors. So we really do make this thing look as accurate as possible. And that, coupled with the fact that Curtiss had excellent blueprints, that all the camouflage on these aircraft was blueprinted camouflage that was the same on all these AVG aircraft. So it was really nice to be able to go here and say, okay, well, look in this area, it's 52 inch wide here, and the rondel gap is 40 inches, 47 here. And so it made it stupid resistant, but not idiot proof. I'll put it that way. So, and the AVG markings, it of course had the nationalist Chinese roundel. And another important aspect to remember is that the fact that this wasn't the communist Chinese that we know today, it was the nationalist Chinese under Chiang Kai-shek that we were supporting. And of course, the famous teeth. So as you can see, the original design was above, and that's the short scoop early version P-40 Hawk 81. So the end model has a larger scoop, so we tried to incorporate design to make it look as much like the teeth on the original Flying Tigers. And Jason Barnett out of South Texas, wonderful artist. He did an amazing job on the teeth and some of the other markings you'll see. So like I said, the AVG was separated into 3 squadrons. There was the 1st Pursuit Squadron, the 2nd Pursuit, and the 3rd. The 1st Pursuit had a white band on the fuselage, so every unit had their own color band. And so here you can see the blue band of the 2nd Pursuit Squadron, which was Tex Hill's unit, and then the 3rd Pursuit, which was Hell's Angels, had the red band. So this has just been an awesome project to work on. The biggest part of this is, of course, the Flying Tiger that's painted on the side of it. And there's a lot of people don't know that the Flying Tiger itself was designed by Walt Disney Studios, and it came as a decal that was self-adhesive. It was not a water-soluble decal. It was a stick-on decal, and it came in 2 parts. There's the Tiger portion and the V. There was a V that you could put a V for victory behind the Tiger, but most of the pilots elected to just use the Tiger. And they quickly found out that at high speeds they raked off. So you had to make sure that that you doped over it with clear paint, essentially, and to keep it on. So the 2nd Pursuit Squadron that Tex Hill was under was called the Panda Bears, and there's always this this sitting panda that everyone kind of knows as the Panda Bears, and it really wasn't. The one you are thinking in your head, if you know what I'm talking about, was never really on their aircraft. Burt Chrisman, who's one of the 2nd Pursuit Squadron aircraft, was pilots, was the one that actually painted all the pandas on the aircraft. And a really cool aspect about restoring this aircraft to be Tex Hill's aircraft is that it doesn't all just honor Tex Hill, who of course is large in life in his own right, but it also honors Bert Chrisman. So Bert, as you can see here, he was a second Pursuit Squadron pilot. He was great friends with Tex, and in fact, he and Tex Hill and Ed Rector, three famous Flying Tigers, all were graduated Pensacola together, were Navy pilots in VB4 on the Ranger prior to the war, and they all signed up together. And Bert Chrisman was actually, prior to the war, he was the Associated Press hired him as a cartoonist and writer, and he did a very famous cartoon strip back in the 30s called Scorchy Smith. And Scorchy Smith, ironically, was a mercenary fighter pilot that was flying over in India, China, and that was all illustrated, written by Bert Chrisman. So that actually writing about it is what led Bert to join the Navy. And then, of course, when some recruiter came to him and asked him to do the exact same thing he wrote about, he jumped on it. And so being that talented artist that he was, here he is with the Associated Press. Obviously, when he got over there, he had to put his drawing abilities to use. So all the aircraft didn't have the sitting panda, and in fact, they all had caricatures of the pilots that flew the aircraft that they adorn. And so here is the original sketch that Bert Chrisman made of the panda for Tex Hill's aircraft, which, of course, Tex being just like his name implies, from Texas and kind of a cowboy. You know, he's got his 6-shooter on his belt, his cowboy hat, and a cattle skull sitting right there. But there are others, you know. Bright, he actually bailed out of an airplane early on in the AVG's history, and of course his panda, based on this sketch, was him pulling a ripcord. Here's Texas. Moose Moss was kind of a country boy, so he's here seen with a jug of moonshine. Jack Newkirk is shown, he's a New Yorker, and I don't know what the story is, but he's got a black eye in this. So each one of these were caricatures of the pilots themselves. So based on the original sketch, we were able to recreate the panda on the aircraft where it should be. And while there's no, like I said, no photos of these markings on Tex Hill's aircraft, through written documents from the age, we know it was put on the aircraft, and the typical spot was about 18 inches high on the right-hand side of the aircraft, just above and behind the trailing edge. So that's where it is today. But it's just been an awesome experience going through all this. So our first taxi test we conducted, and you can kind of see the aircraft in its more original markings here. So as of now, we're finishing up a couple more items on the paint scheme, and awaiting some paperwork from the FAA, and then we should be off to an airshow near you. And another neat homage that is not original to the AVG scheme, but you can see the tail wheel here is painted, the hub cap is painted bright red, and that's our tribute to Mike Dillon for really having the foresight to see past the corroding aircraft down in Port Arthur and save it for us and for generations to come. So we're really excited to hit the airshow tour next year. The aircraft flies in support of the Tor air show routine. It flies the fighter pattern for that, and then we also do air shows all across the nation. So definitely stay tuned for next year. And then finally, before we leave, I would do a disservice if I did not say that the P-40 Warhawk is a part of the CAF's 12 Planes for Christmas. We could really use the support. We have a lot of final touches, a lot of bills coming due, and really it's the last push to get the aircraft back into the air in the coming months. So we really appreciate your support. Go check out the page on fundraiser, and if you have any questions, we can provide you with any information you'd like. So with that, I guess, Steve, I can open it up for
Sure.
some questions. And this is the picture of what happens when you drop your cell phone in the bottom of a P-40.
Yeah, one question I do have, can you pop
Yeah,
that picture back up?
I will.
Um, have you been able to save Tex's signature?
So yes and no. The signature on there, it's a little bit of a misnomer. Was not actually. It's Tex's original signature, but he did not sign it. The aircraft. So we have replicated that signature there, even though it's not original to the paint scheme. It's a tribute to our friend Tex.
All right. Just a couple of random questions that we have here. What year were the Flying Tigers disbanded?
So 42. So
42.
they start. Yeah, they were really enter combat in December of 41. And really by the end of spring 42, they were kind of over that, and the 23rd took over in late 42.
All right. The P-40N model seems to have a little differently configured greenhouse canopy. Can you discuss some of the differences through the
Yeah,
model years?
yeah, absolutely. So the early P-40s, like I think's being referenced, had had the entire rear of the canopy was kind of blocked off, and it had little scalloped windows so you could kind of see behind you. But by the time you got to the in model, visibility was a concern, and they elongated the tail, had a little more room, and so the let's see here, the in model. There you go. The in model has elongated glass and a sloped platform behind you that the fuel tank is under. So really what that did was allowed you to be able to look around and get a little bit more visibility behind you. So the in model was the early models of the P-40 had the small scoops, like I pointed out. Those all P-40s were called the Warhawk by the U.S. The Tomahawks and the Kitty Hawks, like our aircraft is the RCAF Kitty Hawk, was the Commonwealth names for the P-40. The earlier B and C models with the small scoops were the Tomahawks, and when the E model came around with the larger scoop, those subsequent versions were all the Kitty Hawk, and all of them had the Allison engine, except for I think the FNL. They did incorporate the Merlin engine into it, but ours was one of the later variants. The N was one of the last. It was really the last highest produced version of the P-40.
Tell us a little bit about the cooling system in the airplane. When you look straight on, it looks like there's almost three different radiators in there, but it's not, is it?
No, it is not. So you have an oil cooler and two coolant radiators. So there's actually
Right.
three big barrels that are in there, and the aircraft gets hot. I mean, it's a hot aircraft on the ground. So really what you need, the Mustang, you can kind of keep enough RPM on the prop that there's a cooling effect through the radiator on the Merlin, but on this one, it'll overheat if you sit on the ground. So really those two coolant radiators cycles essentially what you put in your car, a Prestone, cycles it all through the engine, and that's how you get your cooling factor, is through the ram air through the holes of basically what's like an old car radiator. Same principles, just heat dissipation. So it's that was kind of the weak spot, I guess, on these inline aircraft. Is Taylor, with hindsight, would probably want to go into war with either two inlines or a radial, because run one round through your coolant tank, and there's no doubt about it, your engine's going to overheat.
All right, just a minute or so left. Any final thoughts as we wrap up tonight?
I really just appreciate you guys having me on. It's an amazing aircraft with amazing history that allows the commemorative Air Force to tell a very, very important story, which is one of volunteerism, sacrifice that the Flying Tigers made. Really the war production effort that Rosie the Riveter built 14,000 of these aircraft in support of our nation and our allies. So I think it just serves as a tool of remembrance of the sacrifice that the greatest generation and those after made. So I really just appreciate everyone's support. I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone has. I'm sure my my contact info is on the Commemorative Air Force homepage, and just feel free to reach out. And we really, really look forward to seeing each and every one of you at an air show in 2021. And like I said, please, we'd appreciate your support in the 12 Planes of Christmas campaign. So with that, thanks for having me.
All right. 12 Planes of Christmas. You can find it right through the Commemorative Air Force website, commemorativeairforce.org. It's right on the homepage. Click on it. Look for the P-40. Make sure you make a donation to the airplane. There are several other airplanes worthy of donations as well, and we do appreciate all the support that we've received so far for 12 Planes of Christmas, and still going on. So if you'd like to make a contribution, we sincerely would appreciate it. And again, Taylor, thank you for taking time tonight to share your knowledge and passion and excitement for not only the P-40, but also for World War II history.
Well, thank you. Nobody that's ever met me can't say I don't love Warbirds.
That's right. All right. Thanks again for joining us, and join us again next Wednesday night for another CAF Warbird Tube webinar. Have a good night, everybody.